The reek of industrial disinfectant and canine fear hung heavy in the concrete block of Kennel Run M. Inside, a force of nature raged against the confines of its steel cage. K9M7, a magnificent sable German shepherd weighing a solid 100 pounds of condensed fury, slammed his body against the door, the metal groaning in protest. His bared teeth were ivory daggers, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest like the promise of an earthquake. Sergeant Major Evans, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh deployments and stricter discipline, stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of disgust and disappointment. "That's it," he barked to the junior handler cowering a few feet away. "Log it. Uncontrollable aggression. Failure to imprint. Liability on 4 legs. The program's done with him." The junior handler, a young airman named Peterson, looked at the majestic, terrifying animal. But Sergeant Major, his lineage, his drive. Evans cut him off with a slice of his hand. "His drive is to tear your throat out, airman. He's washed out. We're not running a rehab for monsters. He's an asset to be liquidated. Schedule the final vet appointment." The words, cold and bureaucratic, sealed the dog's fate. K9M7 was a weapon that refused to be aimed, a tool that had turned on its masters. In the rigid world of military precision, there was no room for such chaos. He was deemed broken beyond repair, a ghost before his time, his only future a quiet room and a merciful needle. The echoes of his furious barks were not cries for help. In the ears of his keepers, they were the sounds of a spectacular and expensive failure. Miles away, in a small, quiet house at the edge of town, Elias Vance planed a piece of reclaimed oak. The rhythmic scrape of the tool was the only sound in his workshop, a meditative cadence that smoothed the wood and soothed the jagged edges of his own past. A former K9 handler from a unit whose designation was spoken only in hushed tones, Elias now lived a life of deliberate solitude. The world had become too loud, too fast, its signals too confusing after years spent communicating in a language of silent gestures and shared instinct. It was during a rare trip into town for supplies that he heard the whispers. 2 young airmen from the nearby base, talking in a hushed corner of the hardware store. "Total psycho. Bit 2 handlers, yeah, Evans is putting him down. Shame. Beast of a dog, perfect specimen, just wrong in the head." Elias froze, his hand hovering over a box of screws. He knew the terminology. He knew the cold calculus of the program. An asset deemed a liability. He also knew what they couldn't see. He saw the world through a different lens, one shaped by years of operating on a razor's edge where the bond between man and animal was not a matter of convenience, but of survival. That evening, he couldn't shake the image of the condemned dog. He saw not a monster, but a mirror. He saw a creature of immense power and loyalty, screaming into a void that didn't understand its language. He saw a soul that had been pushed, prodded, and commanded, but never truly reached. The quiet of his house felt less like peace and more like absence. He made a call, his voice, rusty from disuse, steady and firm, asking about a shepherd on the euthanasia list. The answer he received was a cascade of warnings, but they were just noise. He had already made his decision. The air in the administrative office of the base kennel was stale with resignation. A weary-looking staff sergeant sat across the desk from Elias, a thick file stamped with red warnings open before him. "Sir, I have to advise you against this." "Strongly," she said, her tone pleading. "His file reads like a horror story. He's not a pet. He's not even a workable dog. He's dangerous." Elias simply nodded, his gaze calm. "I've read the file. With all due respect, Mr. Vance, reading the file and standing in front of his kennel are 2 different things." She led him down the corridor. The barking cacophony of the other dogs faded into a tense silence as they approached Kennel M7. The shepherd was there, standing statue still, head low, eyes burning with a cold, intelligent fire. There was no barking, no snarling now. Just a silent, terrifying promise of violence. Elias looked past the bared teeth, past the rigid posture. He saw the subtle tremor in the dog's powerful hind legs, the flicker of uncertainty in its dark eyes. He saw not rage, but profound, world-shattering fear, masked by the only defense it had ever known. "I'll take him," Elias said, his voice quiet but absolute. The sergeant shook her head in disbelief. "The paperwork releases the U.S. government of all liability. You'll be signing that he's your sole responsibility. Anything he does, I understand," Elias interrupted gently. He signed the forms without hesitation. As the kennel door was unlatched, the dog lunged, hitting the end of the catchpole with a force that made the steel rod bow. The staff sergeant flinched. Elias did not. He simply stood there, a quiet island in a sea of fury, and waited. He was not adopting a dog. He was undertaking a mission. A mission to salvage a life that everyone else had thrown away. The ride home was a study in controlled tension. The shepherd sat in a heavy-duty transport crate in the bed of Elias's old pickup, a silent, brooding presence. Elias didn't turn on the radio. He drove with a steady hand, his eyes occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror, not with fear, but with assessment. When they arrived at his secluded property, he didn't immediately release the dog. He backed the truck up to a pre-built, chain-link enclosure that was more fortress than dog run. It was built with military-grade materials, a testament to his foresight. He opened the crate door remotely with a rope, and the dog exploded out, a blur of fur and fury, immediately beginning to pace the perimeter of the new enclosure, testing for weakness. Elias watched for an hour, making no move to approach. Then, he placed a bowl of fresh water and a bowl of high-quality food just inside the gate, using a long pole to slide them in before securing it again. He didn't speak a word. For the next 3 days, this was the entire extent of their interaction. Food and water, delivered silently, at the exact same times each day. No commands. No cooing. No attempts at affection. Elias worked in his shop, always within the dog's line of sight but never engaging directly. The shepherd watched him, his rage slowly simmering down into a state of profound confusion. He was conditioned for conflict, for commands, for correction collars and muzzles. This quiet, respectful distance was a language he did not understand. On the 4th day, as Elias approached with the food, the dog didn't charge the fence. He stood, head cocked, and watched. It was the first crack in the armor. Weeks bled into a month, then 2. The routine never wavered. Elias began to spend time sitting in a chair just outside the enclosure, reading an old book, his voice a low, calm murmur as he read the words aloud. He wasn't talking to the dog, but he was allowing the dog to hear his voice in a non-threatening context. He started using old hand signals, simple gestures from a forgotten training doctrine, a slow, open palm for stand down, a closed fist for stay. He never demanded compliance. He simply offered the signals, then went about his business. One afternoon, as a thunderstorm rolled in, the shepherd began to panic, the crack of thunder triggering a primal fear. He spun in the enclosure, barking frantically. Elias walked to the gate, opened it, and stood there, unafraid. He didn't call the dog. He simply held out a hand, palm open. The dog stopped spinning, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with terror and indecision. He looked at the open gate, a path to freedom, and then at the man, a figure of unshakable calm. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a step forward, then another, until he was just inside the workshop, rain dripping from his coat. He lay down, not near Elias, but in a corner, and watched the storm through the open door, trembling but silent. Elias went back to his work, the scrape of the hand playing a steady rhythm against the drumming rain. Later that evening, as the storm passed, Elias knelt and slid a bowl of food over. The dog ate, then looked at Elias and gave a soft, almost imperceptible whine. It was the first sound he had ever made that wasn't a growl or a bark. Elias looked into the deep, intelligent eyes. "Your name is Pax," he said softly. "It means peace." The dog, Pax, rested his head on his paws, and for the first time since he was a puppy, he closed his eyes in the presence of a human, and truly slept. The transformation of Pax was a quiet miracle, witnessed only by the rustling pines and the circling hawks around Elias's property. The raw aggression that had defined him was still present, but it was no longer a wildfire. It was a forge, its immense heat now contained and controlled by the quiet bond he shared with Elias. They moved together with an unspoken understanding. A tilt of Elias's head, a flicker of Pax's ears, it was a silent, fluid dialogue. Elias began taking him on long hikes in the surrounding wilderness. Pax never wore a leash, trotting a few feet ahead, his senses constantly scanning, his body a perfect instrument of awareness. He wasn't just walking, he was on patrol, clearing the path, securing the perimeter for his one-man unit. The few people from town who saw them from a distance only saw the legend, the broken vet, and his monster dog. Rumors swirled. Some said the dog was a wolf hybrid, others that Elias had broken him with cruelty. They didn't see the moments of quiet affection, Pax resting his heavy head on Elias's knee as they watched the sunset, or the gentle way Elias would check the dog's paws for burrs after a long trek. One afternoon, a young boy chasing a runaway kite strayed too close to Elias's property. Pax saw him first. He didn't bark or charge. He moved silently and swiftly, placing his body between the boy and Elias, a low growl a soft warning in his throat. The boy froze, terrified. Elias walked up calmly. "It's all right," he said, his voice even. "Pax, stand down." Instantly the growl ceased. Pax sat, his eyes never leaving the boy, but his posture relaxed. The boy's mother came running, her face pale with fear. She scooped up her child, ready to scream at Elias, but stopped when she saw the scene, the massive dog, sitting perfectly still, looking to the quiet man for his next command. She saw not a monster, but a guardian. Winter arrived with a vengeance, burying the small town under a sudden, brutal blizzard. What began as a heavy snowfall quickly escalated into a full-blown whiteout, with gale-force winds and plummeting temperatures. Power lines snapped, roads became impassable, and the community was effectively cut off from the outside world. Elias, self-sufficient and prepared, was unconcerned for himself. His cabin was stocked, his generator fueled, and his fireplace roaring. Pax lay before the hearth, a sleeping giant, occasionally twitching as he dreamed. But as the storm raged into its second day, a sense of unease settled over Elias. The wind howled with a mournful, hungry sound. He knew these mountains. He knew how quickly a bad situation could become a fatal one for those less prepared. His solitude had been a shield, but he had never fully abandoned the core tenet of his old life: you don't leave people behind. The static-laced crackle of his emergency band radio confirmed his fears. A desperate, broken transmission from a family a few miles deeper into the woods, the Hendersons. Their generator had failed. A massive pine had fallen, partially collapsing their roof. The father, Mark Henderson, had been injured trying to clear it. His wife's voice was thin with panic, describing a leg injury, the encroaching cold, her 2 young children huddled with her. Mark had been one of the men in town who had been most vocal about his fear of Pax. Elias looked at the howling white abyss outside his window, then down at the powerful animal at his feet. Pax opened his eyes, sensing the shift in Elias's demeanor, and lifted his head, ready. There was no choice to be made. Elias geared up, pulling on thermal layers, waterproof shells, and snowshoes. He packed a trauma kit, flares, thermal blankets, and a thermos of hot broth. When Pax saw the gear, he was on his feet instantly, his body vibrating with purpose. This was not a walk, this was a mission. Elias opened the door, and the wind tore at them, a physical assault of ice and air. Visibility was near zero. For a human, navigating would be impossible. For Pax, it was merely a challenge. "Find them, Pax," Elias said, his voice low and clear over the wind's shriek. "Seek." Pax lowered his head, his powerful nose sifting through the billions of frozen particles, searching for a trace of human scent, of wood smoke, of desperation. He moved with a confidence that defied the storm, a dark shape against the swirling white, Elias following in his wake. They moved through deep drifts and treacherous, hidden terrain. More than once, Pax stopped dead, refusing to move forward, forcing Elias to circle around what he later realized were deep, snow-covered ditches or unstable ground. The dog was not just a compass, he was a surveyor, a pathfinder, his instincts a far more reliable guide than any GPS. After nearly 2 hours of brutal, draining effort, Pax stopped, his head held high, a low whine emanating from his chest. Through the blinding snow, Elias could just make out a faint, flickering light, a candle in the window of the Hendersons' damaged home. They had found them. As they drew closer, a new sound cut through the wind, a high-pitched, frantic snarling. A pack of coyotes, driven mad by hunger and the storm, had been drawn by the scent of the family's dwindling food supplies and their vulnerability. They were circling the damaged cabin, darting in and out of the snowdrifts, their eyes glowing like malevolent embers. Mark Henderson was slumped against the doorframe, a makeshift splint on his leg, trying to fend them off with a fireplace poker, his movements slow and pained. His wife and children were crying inside. Time seemed to slow. Elias saw the scene not as a man, but as a handler. He saw the threat vectors, the closing circle, the imminent danger. Pax saw it too. But there was no wild fury in him now. There was only focus. Pax! Watch! On my mark! Elias commanded, his voice cutting through the gale. Pax's muscles bunched, his body coiling like a spring. He was a weapon, calibrated and waiting for the order to fire. The lead coyote, bold and desperate, lunged for Mark. Mark! Elias shouted. The command was sharp, precise. Pax exploded forward. He was not a dog, he was a projectile of righteous fury. He met the coyote midair, a devastating collision of force and will. He didn't savage it wildly. His movements were brutally efficient, a lifetime of suppressed power and elite training unleashed in a controlled, tactical display. He drove the pack back, not with mindless aggression, but with strategic intimidation, his deep, thunderous barks a declaration of dominance that spoke a language the wild animals understood perfectly. He was the apex predator here. When the last coyote had vanished into the whiteout, Pax returned to Elias's side, his breath misting in the frigid air, and stood guard as Elias rushed to administer first aid to Mark Henderson. Mark, his face ashen, could only stare at the magnificent animal standing sentinel, the dog he had once called a monster, who had just saved his family's life. The storm broke the next morning. When the search and rescue teams finally made it through, they found a surreal scene. Elias had stabilized Mark's leg and moved the family into the most secure part of the house. Pax was lying quietly on the porch, a silent, watchful guardian. News of the rescue spread through the town like wildfire, transforming the narrative of the quiet veteran and his savage dog into one of heroism. But the most stunning confrontation was yet to come. Among the stranded motorists who had taken shelter in the town's emergency center were 2 men from the nearby air base, Sergeant Major Evans and the young airman Peterson. Evans, hearing the incredible story, drove out to the Hendersons' property, his face a mask of cynical disbelief. He arrived to find Elias helping Mark Henderson into an ambulance. Pax stood beside Elias, calm and composed. Evans stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the dog, K9M7, the animal he had personally condemned as a worthless, psychotic failure. He saw no psychosis now. He saw discipline. He saw a powerful bond of loyalty that radiated from the dog to the man. Vance? Evans said, his voice barely a whisper. That's M7-inch. Elias looked at him, his expression not of triumph, but of a deep, quiet sadness. His name is Pax. Evans was speechless. All his metrics, his protocols, his rigid assessments, had failed. They had measured aggression but had never sought to understand its source. They saw an uncontrollable weapon, while Elias had seen a terrified soldier who needed a new commanding officer, one who would lead with trust, not force. How? Evans finally managed to ask. You threw away a life because you were afraid of it, Elias said, his voice level, devoid of accusation. I just gave him a reason to live for something other than his fear. You trained him to be a weapon. I reminded him he could be a guardian. Elias placed a hand on Pax's head, and the great dog leaned into his touch, a picture of devotion. Evan stood there, stripped of his arrogance, humbled before the quiet truth: the greatest potential is often hidden within what we are too quick to discard. For Elias and Pax, their shared redemption was complete, not in the accolades of the town, but in the silent, unbreakable peace they had finally found together.